The average gamer is paying more for a GPU than they did last year, for example. That's good for shareholders, but it's definitely not good for gamers. We have some really bad news from AMD. This is going to be something that probably will disappoint a lot of you. AMD is supposed to be the one that's going to save everybody, right? From Nvidia's high prices like they did with Intel. Well, I don't think so. And I'm going to tell you why it's wrong to think like that. And it's kind of shocking, actually, even though knowing they're a corporation, it's the type of stuff they're going to do. At the end of the day, it's not really friendly towards the consumer.
It's never stop thinking about how to delight your customer.
And are you ready for this? Instead of lowering prices on GPUs like the 7900 XT, which nobody is buying, they're going to limit the amount of GPUs that they're shipping. AMD is definitely not your friend. Don't think that they're going to save you from Nvidia's high prices like they did for a little while with Intel, but they learned from the best, you can say, or learned from the worst. They're doing the exact same behavior that we always got mad at for Nvidia, for Intel to do, anti-consumer behavior that really just focuses on their shareholders and them as a corporation and not pleasing the customer. At the end of the day, isn't the number one thing of a successful company to make sure that the customer is happy? That's what a lot of long-term corporations really work on. Warren Buffett said that you have to delight the customer.
Not to satisfy your customer, but to delight your customer. And no company's ever failed, but that had millions of delighted customers, and you start with them and you get them one at a time.
AMD is delighting number one, which is going to be the shareholders and how much money they're making, which may be good for them in the short term, but at the end of the day, I don't think it'll be good for either them and especially not for gamers. So, and now let's hear a word from our sponsor, VIP-CDKdeals.com, a Windows 10 Pro CD key. Add to cart, you put in code CC20. This will also work on Windows 11. You want to go into your settings in Windows, change and adjust your CD key, click activate, and now let's go back to the video. Limiting the shipment of both CPUs and GPUs makes sense. There's less people buying them, but here's the problem. They're limiting them, and of course, this is going to keep prices high. The other strategy that they can take would be a lot friendlier towards the consumer. For example, if they start to lower the prices on their outrageously priced hardware. They caught up with Intel and passed them in the CPU phase, but look at this ridiculous pricing that they have right now. At a local micro center, they're selling the 7900 for $429. You may say, oh, that's a pretty fair price for, a pretty good CPU that's brand new. Remember, this is going to be the little bit slower non-X variant. In the same micro center, they're also selling the 7900X, which is faster, with 32 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM for free for $417. Do you see what's happening here? AMD can't read the market, and that's why things like this are happening. How can you possibly sell a faster CPU and give the buyer free RAM and at the same time charge less for it than a CPU that's supposed to be cheaper? That doesn't make any sense at all. The only sense it makes is that AMD has no idea what they're doing, releasing these CPUs into the market. And then look at what they're doing with X3D. They're releasing the most expensive ones first at fairly high prices, even though they're enthusiast parts, and they're delaying the 7800 X3D, which is the cheapest one and most likely the one that most people would buy, because they don't want to cannibalize all of the sales of their really poorly released CPU so far. Are they good products? Yeah, but it's not really the appropriate time to be releasing this amount of products in a very soft market when people aren't buying, and you get stuff like this happening. So AMD's response to also GPUs and different things that aren't selling, they're going to stop shipping as many. They should have done it before instead of really saturated the market and caused these pricing issues. And then prices will stay high for like a 7900 XT, which nobody's buying at $899. That should be maybe at most like a $699 GPU. Maybe if you want to be really, really conservative, $799. At least it competes with the 4070 Ti at that point. And if they priced it cheaper, they would be able to gain more more market share. Wouldn't that be better for not only them and also the consumer? It makes a lot of sense to me. If they're holding back shipments, they're losing money anyway. It's a lot of stuff they produced already, stuff that's not selling. They have to pay for warehouse space. So that's definitely money that they're losing. But maybe that seems better in the eyes of investors who don't really look at it from a consumer side. AMD is going to sell less GPUs, and that way they're not going to lose as much money. It doesn't really make any sense. And if they heard that AMD's cutting prices on GPUs, maybe that comes off poorly. Maybe the product isn't good or something like that. That's the way they view things, which I believe is really incorrect. One of the things that they boast about the most when they're doing these like quarterly earnings is that the average price for their products have gone up. Nvidia loves to say that. And that's the perspective AMD is coming from, proving that they never were your friend. The only reason that they seemed better when they were going up against Intel CPUs is because they had to be competitive. Nobody was going to buy their CPUs because they weren't as good initially as what Intel had, and it took a little while and they were able to pass them. As soon as they did, all we see now are high CPU prices from AMD, really high, and even cut down motherboards that they changed the product stack of various motherboards as well to be able to sell them at a certain price. So they're very anti-competitive at this point, not to mention what's going on with the GPUs. I mean, the 7900 XTX is the only one that seems to be selling fairly well, but even that one seems very difficult to find. And this is just a long list of really bad decisions AMD has made recently. Of course, we can see how they reacted to the 7900 XTX cooler problems. It wasn't very consumer friendly at first. They were like denying people's returns. That wasn't very good. The release of RDNA 3 itself was a bit lukewarm because they really stretched the truth in a lot of those graphs, and they even had to apologize for it. And then even recently, they're comparing like their 6950 XT, and they're showing that it's actually pretty close to a 7900 XT. So the value of these much more expensive new GPUs really isn't there. The 7900 XTX is the only one that makes any sense, but you can't get it. Everything else is just a really, really bad value proposition, and nothing at all is really aimed at delighting the customer, something that should be the goal of these companies, and not delighting just shareholders. Because remember, shareholders will be ecstatic when a big company will fire 10,000 people. They're not viewing it from like the human consumer or even employee perspective. They view it simply as a number. And at the end of the day, that's not how a company will be successful in the very, very long term. If you look at certain companies that have made it for decades, a lot of them will delight the customer. Look as an example at Intel, who's had their worst quarterly earnings that basically anybody has ever seen. And the company has to lay off a massive amount of people. And it's all because they weren't innovating. They weren't thinking of delighting the customer. And now they're going to pay the price. So AMD is definitely going to pay the price in the future if they continue with this behavior. Consumers are smart. They're going to see what's going on. Because imagine, instead of AMD stopping a lot of GPU shipments, what if they actually focused on like the 7900 XTX, maybe even made the price a little bit better and sold a whole ton of them to gain more market share? More gamers would buy it. So the drivers would get better. Developers would develop, better implementation of AMD drivers within their games. Overall, that would mean AMD would become a much bigger company. But as it is now, they're going the opposite way. And remember, look at what happened to Intel.